Afternoon, everybody. We still have a line of people coming in, but we should probably get started. Thanks for being here. I'm Dr. Ramage of the Theology Department and co-director of the Center for Integral Ecology. And along with my co-director, Dr. Begayong, who is in Chem Lab at the moment still, we run the center dedicated uniquely to fostering care for creation from a robustly Catholic point of view. And part of that, as our popes say, is that man too has a nature that must be respected. And part of understanding man is understanding where we came from. So where we came from, how we're the image of God, and of course that inevitably raises the question of evolution. And so we have here today the pleasure and blessing of having Dr. Dan Kuebler from Franciscan University of Steubenville with us. So he teaches courses on evolution, cell physiology, and science and faith. His scientific research involves examining the heterogeneity of human mesenchymal stem cells found in bone marrow, fat, and placental tissue. He's host of the Purposeful Lab podcast, I highly recommend, a podcast that examines the order and purpose inherent in the world around us, and the Catholic Scientist podcast, the official podcast of the Society of Catholic Scientists. Dan is the author of the recent and excellent Darwin and Dogma, the compatibility of evolution and Catholicism from Word on Fire Press just this past year, and co-author of The Evolution Controversy, a survey of competing theories from Baker Academic back in '07. He has written and continues to write academic and popular articles on issues related to science, religion, and ethics. He's vice president of the Society of Catholic Scientists and is on the board of the Spitzer Magis Center. He's been married to his wife for 29 years, has 6 kids, and resides in Steubenville. And thanks to Nellie for letting you come to us. And we want to offer a warm welcome now to Dr. Dan Kuebler. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramage, for that kind introduction. And I've hosted this podcast, and I realized like the success of the podcast depends on the guests that you get. And so Dr. Ramage is a guest on this upcoming season of the podcast. So the Purposeful Lab. So if you're interested, it's all about evolution in the church and its teaching. And so Dr. Ramage's his episode will probably be out in about a month or so. So I'll let you know. But that's it's a pleasure to be. I've never this is my first time visiting Benedictine. Obviously, I've heard about it quite a bit. Being a Franciscan, a lot of students go back and forth between start at Franciscan to transfer or come for a grad degree that at Franciscan that we're at Benedictine, and so it's a pleasure to be here and to see this many people come to the talk. So my talk is on human origins, creation, and evolution. I just sort of give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, so you can sort of see where we're going to be going here in the next probably about 45 minutes. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Okay, so we've got 4 parts to the talk. The first and the last part are a little bit shorter than the middle of the talk. And the first and the last talk a little bit about some theology, some philosophy. The middle part of the talk, and the majority of it, is looking at sort of the science. What does that tell us about hominid evolution and human evolution? So I'm just going to start just briefly to frame what I'm going to be talking about, a general overview of the Catholic teaching on creation and human evolution, just so we have some principles in place for what I'll be discussing. The second part, I'm going to give just a quick general overview of hominid evolution. I just, because a lot of people have a view of it that's very, very simplistic, in terms of how species have changed relatively recently, leading to modern humans. And then we'll look at the difficulty of finding humans in the fossil record and in the archaeological record, all right? And the difficulties both from a scientific perspective, but also from a theological perspective, right? And then we'll finish with some speculation on, once we understand, okay, this is the context in which human evolution occurs, how do humans made in the image and likeness of God emerge from that, all right? So that's where I'm going to try to go with this talk, okay? So the first thing to recognize is what the Catholic meaning when we're talking about creation is. What's sort of the root, sort of the non-negotiables? As I think a lot of times the confusion is around creation and evolution issues because comes out of not defining our terms very well, right? And so I'm going to focus on three key points because they sort of set up what we would expect with the science of evolution to be able to do and what it would not be able to do, right? Obviously, this is not an exhaustive understanding of the Catholic dogma of creation, but the first is that the universe owes its existence to God, right? And it's dependent upon God. And it's dependent upon God not at just the beginning, but at every moment, right? At every moment, regardless of what's going on, whether it's wherever you're at in the evolutionary process, that evolutionary process is going to owe its existence to God at each and every moment, right? And not only that, we as a species owe our existence to God, right? And God deliberately intended to create us. So we don't have a situation where God creates an evolutionary process, looks down and says, wow, there's some interesting hairy hominids running around Africa, and is surprised. Like whatever happens in the evolutionary process, God knows from all eternity. He intends whatever happens in that evolutionary process, and that our existence is a particular event, right? The final thing is that God created man in his image. And what does that mean? That we are more than a material being, right? We are created as a unity of body and soul. We're not a separate body and a separate soul, but a unity of the two. And the beautiful image of Genesis, of the dirt and the breath of God coming together to make one. Our soul is manifest through the earthly body, right? But that then gives us some limitations of what we would expect from the science of evolution, right? So the science of evolution cannot explain the totality of man, right? So what we can learn from science is not going to be able to tell us everything there is to know about the human person. But if we ignore the science of evolution, we ignore this, the biological nature of man, we then also are going to come to an inadequate understanding of the human person, right? So it's a both and, as I was talking to students this afternoon, and that's pretty common with sort of the Catholic approach to reality. It's a both and, right? So understanding, the human evolution is going to lead to a deeper understanding of the human person, but it's not going to give us everything, right? So the question I often get is from students when I particularly the non-science majors, when I talk about evolution, is to talk about what is the church's position on evolution, right? Well, the reality is the church doesn't have a position on the science of evolution, right? So what it is, the church is not in the business in the sense of weighing in on scientific theories as pure science. Is this the better scientific theory, or is this a better scientific theory, right? So the church, what it has said about the science of evolution, about human evolution, is not so much an endorsement of it, but it is how might and what are the parameters for sort of integrating this with a Catholic understanding of the human person. So the first time the church in an official document talks about human evolution is in Humani Generis, 1950. So this is about 90 years after Darwin publishes his Origin of Species. So there's a lot that goes on in those 90 years, but it's not until 1950 that human evolution is specifically addressed, right? And Pope Pius XII mentions this, and I'll just read it. He says, the teaching authority of the church does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on part of men experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution. And he's really referring to the scientific theory of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existing in living matter. All right, so there's two things here that I just want to draw out. The first is that he's talking about there needs to be a dialogue. He's talking about men and women that are experienced in both fields, both theology and science, that there needs to be a both and, a dialogue between these two disciplines. And there is nothing in sort of Catholic teaching that would preclude the idea that the human body, the physical form, actually is something that is related to other living organisms, that has evolved in some case. The other thing that he points out, that he does make clear, is that all humans, the modern humans, must have originated via common descent from our first human ancestors. The whole human family is related, right? And that's another point he makes in that document, that you can't have, oh, there's humans emerged over here and some other humans emerged over here and they're not related, right? That we're all one human family, right? So regardless of how the certain people might interpret things, he said that's something we know by faith. Okay? the framework that I use for approaching this and is through the framework that Pope Benedict lays out. And this is a quote from a series of homilies he gave in the 1980s. And he's thought deeper and more widely than I think any other Catholic theologian on evolution. And he talks about, again, that it's a both and, right? So when he's talking about creation and evolution, he says we cannot say creation or evolution in as much as these two things correspond to two different realities. He says the Genesis creation account does not in fact explain how human persons come to be, but rather it's saying what they are, right? They are made in the image and likeness of God, right? They have an eternal destiny. They are a unity of body and soul. He said, and vice versa, the theory of evolution seeks to explain and describe biological developments, right? And as it does that, it's not going to be able to explain the purpose or destiny of man. That's not something that biologists do. They can explain, or paleontologists, they can explain sort of the developments of the physical form of the human body, right? And he says to that extent, we're faced here with two complementary rather than mutually exclusive realities, right? So what that does, I think it sort of frees you up as a Catholic scientist to explore whatever the science is going to show you, because you don't have a competing reality. Well, I'm afraid that the science is going to show me something that conflicts with Catholic teaching, right? And that's something that comes out anytime the church talks about science, is the truth does not contradict truth. So any scientific truth that we're able to reveal, scientific fact we're able to reveal, is not something that's going to conflict with something that we have been revealed to by faith. Okay, so with that set up, I want to go on to talk about hominin evolution. Right? So what is hominin evolution? Hominin is any fossil form that is more closely related to modern humans than to modern chimps. The current theory is that about 7 million years ago, so down here at the base of this figure, you have some type of common ancestor, and then on one branch, a branch that I don't have up here, leads to modern chimps. And there's really not much known about that branch. And the reason, because there's not that many fossils, because most of that occurred in West Africa, where you have a very humid, hot climate, and fossilization doesn't happen very, very readily. Things get scavenged and broken down, and there isn't much money because people aren't as interested in the chimp ancestors as they are as hominin ancestors. So the hominids are anything that flow from this common ancestor that are more related to modern humans. Right? Now, there's roughly sort of, I try to break this down into three sort of phases, just so you have an idea of what's going on here. The three phases that have occurred in hominin evolution and over the last 6 to 7 million years. The base of the tree down here, the first phase, is down here like 4.5 to 7 million years ago. And there's not much in the fossil record from that period. There's a few fossils, and they're all in Africa. All right. Particularly if you get to 6 to 7 million years, there's very, very little. There's a few more once you get to 5 to 4 million years. But everything is in Africa. Everything's relatively small brain, and you haven't had all the adaptations for upright posture and upright walking. So you still have like an opposable toe, like that chimps have, right? That can grasp things that we don't have, right? We have arches for upright posture. You have much bigger, more stable, large, big toe. And so, again, that's all occurring in Africa. The second phase is this African diversification phase, right? From 4 to 2 million years ago, somewhere right in here. Again, all the hominid fossils you find in this phase are all in Africa. Right? And you see all kinds of different types of forms. There's a radiation of forms of the hominid form then. Right? The final phase is the last roughly 2 million years, right? And in this phase, you start to see hominids coming out of Africa, right? You see waves of hominids coming out of Africa. The first one is Homo erectus that leaves Africa, goes to the Middle East. The Levant ends up in Asia and Southeast Asia. And then you have, after that, you have Homo Neanderthals, who leave Africa probably around 500,000 years ago. And finally, eventually, modern humans that are thought, as we'll see, probably originated in Africa and start to leave Africa off and on about 100,000 years ago. And then finally, a big wave leaves Africa about 50 to 60,000 years ago. All right. Now, one of the things you notice, if you look up at that figure, right, you see a lot of question marks. And that's the reality of trying to reconstruct the hominid fossil record, right? It's very, very messy. Right? So what you have of the hominid fossil record is you have what I call mosaic evolution. Right, so you always see like a bumper sticker here, like you have this gradual progressive change. The ape slowly starts to get more human-like, and everything's moving in one direction. The reality is that it's not clear. You have, particularly in this phase here, 2 million to 4 million years ago, you have all kinds of different hominid forms, and some of them are getting bigger brains, some of them are growing smaller brains, evolving smaller brains. Some are having large, robust jaws. Other are having smaller jaws. So you see a mosaic of traits. So it's not clear how all of these hominid forms are related. But what you have is more of like an experimentation of the hominid form going on in Africa at this time, right? And this mosaicism is, in a sense, you see this over and over again during evolutionary transitions, where different features are evolving, but not in a sort of a linear fashion, right? And just give you a couple examples of this on the next couple slides. All right, so these are two species that you find that are contemporary during this time, Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, right? And if you look at, they're both found around 2 million years ago. And if you look at them, there are certain features that are more modern in Homo habilis, but then there's other features where Homo rudolfensis looks more modern, more like a modern humans, right? So if we look at Homo rudolfensis first, right, you can see it's got it's taller, it's got a bigger brain capacity. So this looks more like a modern human in those characteristics, right? But then if you look at the jaws and the teeth, right, Homo habilis looks more like a modern human, has a thinner jaw, right, has narrow molars, whereas Rudolfensis has a much larger jaw. So it's not clear which one is more related to modern humans, right? And there's debates amongst paleontologists of how to fit all of these together. But what we do see over time in this this bushy tree is that on average, you have a relative average increase in brain size over time. So if we go back to 5 million years ago and say, well, who's the biggest brain hominid at the time? And you're going to find something about 400 cc's, a little more than a can of Coke, right? If you go back 2 million years, say, who's the biggest brain hominid? It's going to be about 800 cc's, right? So that's going to be 2.5 cans of Coke, right? But you're also going to find ones that have 400 cc's. So it's not as if everybody's getting a bigger brain. If you go back 1 million years, now the biggest brain hominid is close to 1,000 cc's. And you go to more modern humans, like you and I, you're going to see some between 1,200 and 1,400 milliliters or cc's. But even then, you still have some species that have some at all these times, just because the brain size is getting bigger in erectus. There's other hominids that have smaller brains. So it's not like everybody is evolving a larger brain. Okay? The other thing that you find with the hominid fossil record is that humans and a lot of the advanced hominids are extremely migratory, right? So they don't stay in the same place that long. Right? There's been a lot of work recently on this as people have been better able to sequence ancient genomes. Right? And if you're interested in this, this is book David Reich. He's at Harvard, and he's this book, Who We Are and How We Got Here. And they've been able, with new technology, to be able to purify human DNA from bones that are 10,000, 20,000, 40,000, 50,000 years old, and be able to map sort of migrations of hominids and humans. And what we find is that almost every time, if the humans that are living in a certain area, right, are different than the humans that lived there 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. The genetic populations have been moving in and out over time. And this seems to be the case that what you have is hominid populations migrating back and forth and interbreeding, right? Where you have sort of mosaicism. Why you would get this mosaicism? You have a trait, you have a population that has a large brain, another one that has a small jaw, they interact, and then their offspring, then you get some that have both a large brain and a small jaw, right? And so you see this as a general pattern in the hominid fossil record. Okay, well, out of this, what we're interested in is how out of this do modern humans emerge, okay, out of this sort of messiness, right? So how do you find modern humans in the fossil record, right? Well, that to answer that question, it depends on what you mean by human, right? And I want to make a distinction between something that's biologically human and what we would use theologically human, right? So as a biologist or as a paleontologist, you're out there looking at fossils. What would be your criteria for identifying something as biologically Homo sapiens? Right? We're not going to look and say, well, this thing have a mortal soul, this thing have rational conceptual thought. I mean, you can't do that, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to have certain physical criteria. All right, the brain has to be of this size, right? It's got to have this skeletal characteristics and so forth, right? It's got to have certain, if you're able to sequence some of its genome, it's got to have this sort of roughly this sequence and so forth, right? But there's some physical characteristics you're going to say, if it has these physical characteristics, it's human. Right. If you look at these two skulls up here, right? This one right here on the right is a human skull from dates to about 40,000 years ago, right? And that skull, the cranial capacity of that one's about 1250, right? 1250 cubic centimeters or milliliters. And it looks very similar if we were to take any of your skulls and put it on a table. You'd have a hard press to tell the difference between the two, right? So it's pretty unambiguous in that case that that thing is biologically should be grouped in the species Homo sapiens, right? The one to the left, okay, this one right here, right? So that one there, that one's got very similar cranial capacity. It's almost identical cranial capacity. That one dates to 300,000 years ago. Right? And if you look at it, you can see that it's a little flatter. It's almost like the brain case has been compressed, so it's more elongated, right? So it's got the same brain capacity. It's got a relatively flat face, small jaw, has a lot of characteristics that you might associate with modern humans, but the brain shape is a little bit different, right? Should that be characterized biologically as Homo sapiens? There is no obvious answer to that question. And there's actually no way to really identify if that thing should be. So there is a certain, in terms of classifying amongst paleontologists and biologists, there is a certain, you might call it arbitrariness, but there's certain bias. That certain people say, well, anything, the people that think that the brain size is more important might say, yeah, that's going to be a modern human. Others that are more worried about the brain shape and the formation, I say, well, maybe not, right? But there isn't some book to look up to know that's got to be a biological human. And that's why in this field, there's interminable debates about how to classify these organisms. So you can see how difficult it is to determine whether something's biologically human. All right. How would you determine something's theologically human in the fossil record? Yeah, go ahead. If you. Okay, so you're going to have to look for some type of cultural artifacts, right? Like burial things, like art, things like that. You have to look at, the skeleton is not going to tell you, right? But you can look and see in the archaeological record, do you have things that you would say, these are the type of things that could only be made by someone with a rational conceptual thought, with a human soul, right? Those are the type of things that might be able to suggest that something's theologically human. But as you see, if you look at this painting here, right, is that something that this cave painting would, if you saw that, we'd say, well, that had to be made by someone exactly like you and me with rational conceptual thought, or that could be made by a relatively adept, advanced hominid that would be doodling on a cave wall, right? Again, it's not clear in many cases. So the point is as we go through here, and I'm going to quickly go through sort of the fossil record, there's a lot of debate over where you can draw lines. Well, that's where modern humans emerge, okay? Because it's not clear biologically or theologically because a lot of the evidence is open to a lot of different interpretations, okay? So up until about, I would say, the 2000, right? The dominant view of the origin of humans was that humans emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago. They spread through the rest of Africa, leave Africa, and go out and colonize the rest of the globe besides Antarctica. Okay, well, that was a view that was held largely because of the evidence of the time suggested that the earliest um, modern human fossils were found in East Africa. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. All right. So if you look at the earliest fossils that people argue are Homo sapiens, you find them all over Africa. Right? So the earliest ones up until the last 15 years were these ones from the Homo Kibish in Ethiopia over here. And they're dated to about 200,000 years. And that's what people thought modern humans must have emerged in East Africa. But since that time, people have identified other fossils. There's two others. There's this group here in Morocco that date to about 300,000 years ago. And that fossil that I was showing there, the one that was sort of squished, that's an example of one of these. They found like 6 relatively well-preserved skulls. They have the same brain capacity as modern humans. They have a slightly different shape. It's a little more elongated. But these seem to, a lot of people classify these as modern humans. There's another fossil that was found down here in South Africa, this Florisbad fossil, that again it's sort of a hybrid between like a Neanderthal skull and maybe a modern human skull, but it's not clear how to classify it, right? And so what you see, rather than, modern humans emerge for sure right here, you see sort of mosaicism, certain traits of modern humans popping up all over Africa during this time. Okay, and this is just a bigger a view of those 2 skulls I had before. This is the one that's 300,000 years old, has the same brain size, but it's got a different brain shape. And this is a clear modern human fossil. It's only about 40,000 years old, right? And if you analyze sort of the brain case, you can see a little bit better over here, the longer, flatter brain case there for the red one. And that longer, flatter brain case is something that you also see not only in this fossil, you also see with Neanderthals. Neanderthals have a longer, flatter, where modern humans have more globular brain, right? Their frontal lobe is a little bit bigger, where Neanderthals use the back of their brain a little bit more. Okay? And so it does seem that in Africa at the time, you have a lot of different hominid populations moving around Africa, not just in East Africa, but you have South Africa, you have North Africa. The one place you don't find, again, is in West Africa, and that's probably not because there weren't hominids living there. It's probably because of it's not the best place for fossilization to take place because of the tropical environment there. And so most of the time, it doesn't favor fossilization. Right? Now, the genetic evidence for the origin of modern humans, right? We can look at the genetic evidence, look at the DNA and see, based on the DNA of present humans, when might there have been a most recent common ancestor of all modern humans. This is can be done by looking at mitochondrial DNA, can be looking at the Y chromosome, or can be looking at genomic DNA. But the mitochondrial DNA is the one that probably has gotten the most attention. So what they do with this, the mitochondrial DNA is a small circular DNA that's found in our mitochondrial organelles, and it's only inherited from the mother, right? So you get all your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. So if you look at the mitochondrial DNA, you're looking at your mother's lineage, okay? And if you sequence that the mitochondrial DNA, you can, of different human populations, and we know how often the mitochondrial DNA sort of mutates, you can look back and extrapolate back when was there the most recent common ancestor of all of these modern human populations that are here. So you're looking back and say, when do you have sort of someone that lives here, right? And when you do this, the dates flow depending on the method that you use, but the dates range from 150,000 years to 250,000 years, right? Now, this is not necessarily the first person. This is just the most recent common ancestor on our mother's mother's mother. So we trace back everybody in this room on the mother's lineage. Eventually, you're going to find someone who's the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of all of us. But that person does not have to be the biblical Eve. This is the person. It could have been a one woman in a population, and she's the only one whose female offspring have survived to the present day, right? And it's pretty common for lineages to go extinct like that, a female lineage or a male lineage to go extinct. But this date sort of fits with when you first start to see in the fossil record modern human fossils in Africa. So you have this overlap between this date, about 200,000 years ago. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of where you get sort of the biological humans. What about theological humans? Okay, so what can we know about this from the fossil record, right? And so what I'm going to look at is just give a brief overview of the archaeological record, right? So when do you see things that are suggestive of someone that has rational conceptual thought being on the scene? So just having tools is simple tools. We know chimps use tools, crows can use pebbles to as tools. So just using tools is not something that necessarily is associated with rational conceptual thought, right? That's not going to identify of humans for us. But there are certain things like composite tool use, and I'll talk about that in a second, what that is, and sort of ritualistic beads and so forth, and art that would be suggestive. We saw those, whoever made that was going to be human just like you and I, right? And so when do we start to see this come on the scene? Right? Well, you start to see sort of these tools suggestive of someone that has modern, like rational conceptual thought. In the Middle Stone Age. So the Middle Stone Age tools are a tool set that is found, the dates estimates vary, but from about 300,000 years to about 50 to maybe 25,000 years ago, right? And I'm going to focus on just one of these, the hafting techniques, okay? Because the hafting techniques are tools that it seems that to be able to do this, you would have to be human like you and I. You'd have to have sort of sort of rational and have a concept of what you're making, and have an imagination and foresight and planning in a way that modern humans do that other organisms don't, right? So hafting techniques, where you have a composite tool like these things here, where you have a handle, you have a blade on it, you have sort of an animal hide, and you have a resin, right? So you have multiple pieces that you have to go get, and you have to assemble this thing. It's not something where you just have to take one stone and break it, right? Where you don't have to have very much foresight, right? And you find these hafting techniques. You find, like, for example, these handles that have been found. These are about 150,000 years old that have resins, tar and birch resins on the end of them, found right next to stones that have a wear pattern that's suggestive that they were attached to these things. So you start to see these composite tools showing up about 100 to 150,000 years ago. So again, would be suggestive of sort of rational conceptual thought. Another thing you start to see roughly around the same time is the wide use of ochre, which is a pigment, right? A red clay pigment, has iron in it, right? And it's used by a lot of Aboriginal humans in Africa for body decoration and so forth. And you start to see widespread use of this, particularly once you cross that 150,000 year mark. So you see ochre at certain sites in Africa, sporadically up to about 150,000 years ago. But down here, you see ochre use sort of skyrocket from 150,000 years to like 40,000 years, both in South Africa, East Africa, and in North Africa. So it's all over the place. Right? You also see jewelry, right? So East Africa, about 50,000 years ago, you start to see ostrich egg shells that are sliced in sort of a very specific pattern, right? Suggestive that they were strung together with jewelry. About 70,000 years ago, you see in Blombos Cave in South Africa, you see these shells that have been drilled, right, and punctured in sort of the exact same location, and have a wear pattern suggesting that they were threaded together for purposes of jewelry, right? You see the same thing in the Middle East, in the Levant. There's a cave where you found these shells. Again, they were punctured in very, very specific locations. This was found well away from the seashore. It's about 5 or 6 miles from an elevation where these things wouldn't have just washed up. They were taken there into a cave specifically and have been hollowed out. So what you see is you start to see early signs of ritual and art. Again, it's sort of sporadic, mosaic in nature. It's spread out. There's not a privileged location, this idea that everything starts in East Africa. Then about 50,000 years ago, and this coincides with the last wave of modern humans leaving Africa. So all non-Africans are related to the humans that leave Africa 50,000 years ago. And they spread throughout the globe and displaced all other populations, hominid populations, whether human or otherwise. And just at that time, you also see this rapid expansion of art, and it shows up everywhere, right? It shows up in Africa, it shows up in Asia, it shows up in Europe. And so once you cross that 50,000-year barrier, you start to see this representative cave art that is sort of indicative of modern humans, right? You see it in Indonesia, this is southern Germany, these both are from Indonesia. This is cave paintings from France, and this is from Africa, right? So you see clear signs. So at this point, before 50,000 years, you had to have had theological humans emerging somewhere, such that all of these descendants would be united by common descent, right? Now, there's some, some caveats with this. So this is a cave painting I pointed out before. This is a cave painting from La Pasiega, Spain, that's dated to 64,000 years ago. It's dated relatively accurately. They dated these deposits here that have seeped through the rock, right? So they date those deposits, they get the date of those, and they know the art has to be older than that, right? Because the art was there first and the deposit came. And at this point in time, humans hadn't made their way into Europe, right? And so this was a time when only Neanderthals were the only hominid in Europe. So the question is where and how this painting came about. Is this something that Neanderthals does? Is that then indicative of Neanderthals having rational conceptual thought? But you can see this painting is distinctly qualitatively different than, say, these representative images that you have here that are clearly were made in locales where humans were dominant. So it's not clear with this one, is this something that is indicative of Neanderthals necessarily having rational conceptual thought? But we can talk about that in the Q&A if you have questions about that. Okay. So what does this sort of all mean? This is sort of the last part of the talk. So how do we synthesize all this, and what does this mean for the origin of modern humans and the origin of humans? All right. So science is pretty clear that the oldest biological humans are found in Africa, right? Exactly which ones and where and what date is less clear, right? Because it gets very difficult to pin down what classifies as a modern human. Okay. But the fossil data does indicate that modern human traits, right, emerge in a mosaic fashion throughout Africa 200 to 300,000 years ago, right? You see some of those traits in South Africa, some of those traits in North Africa, some of those traits in East Africa. And then again, like I said, they probably were in West Africa. You just don't have fossils to show that, right? The genetic data, as I sort of hinted at, suggests that these populations weren't isolated. It wasn't as if this population was in East Africa and they didn't interact with any of the other populations in Africa. It was pretty clear that there was trade going on, right? Some of those ostrich beads, you find them in East Africa. You see very similar ones showing up in South Africa as if they were being, as populations were moving back and forth. So those populations were probably connected to some extent by some gene flow, right? Now, signs of rational conceptual thought, I think so really clear signs of rational conceptual thought. You find some people that argue that you can push rational conceptual thought back even further, 20,000, 30,000 years ago. But I would rather see more robust examples to say that there was rational conceptual thought. And I think you see very good evidence of that about 100,000 years ago. That doesn't mean there wasn't rational conceptual thought beforehand, but this sort of puts a date, sort of a minimum date of how old the first theological humans must have been. And this rational conceptual thought is concentrated in and around Africa. Okay? And those signs then become widespread throughout the globe about 50,000 years ago. Right? So with that data, it seems that theological humans made in the image and likeness of God, like you and I, probably emerge in Africa in the last 150 to 250,000 years, somewhere in that range. Right? And how might that have emerged? I would suggest one of probably the most likely, possibilities is that there's a hybridization between two of these migratory populations, right? So you have these migratory populations in Africa. You have certain characteristics appearing in this population, other characteristics appearing in this population. As they migrate and interbreed, you have a new species that has a mix of those traits, has, you know, the traits that we would associate with modern Homo sapiens, right? We do know that modern humans have interbred with other hominid populations, right? So in particular, that last wave of humans that leave Africa 50,000 years ago, we know, and there's very good evidence that they interbred with Neanderthals, right? And so all non-African modern humans, and there's non-native African modern humans, have roughly 2% of your genome as alleles, has Neanderthal alleles, right? It's picked up some Neanderthal DNA, and it's lasted to the present day. So there was some interbreeding with these other hominid populations, and that just shows like how messy sort of the evolutionary history of humans is. So these populations are continually separating and then coming back together and interbreeding. Okay? So speculation on how these humans emerge, right? I would suggest that you have these distinct biologically human populations in Africa. Biologically, that meaning that they may have been able to interbreed with modern humans, right? As these populations migrate, you have two distinct populations are able to interbreed. In this figure, who knows where they are, but I just put them down as you know, A and B there, that blue one. They interbreed and give rise to a population that is the type of thing that's fitting to be rationally ensouled. Theological humans emerge from this, right? And so what that would mean is that these modern humans, theological humans, emerge from in the context of sort of biological humans that are not rationally ensouled, right? And so I want to just sort of talk about this and end with this. And right? So we think about the origin of the first humans, right? There is a continuity and a discontinuity. So evolutionarily, there would be a continuity in that the first humans would be biologically continuous with other non-human hominid populations, right? But at the same time, there's a discontinuity because you are either the type of thing to be fitting to be have a rational soul, or you're not, right? So there's that discontinuity. So how do you go about that, right? And so I think there's so the first option takes away, and that's why I put it in italics. I won't talk about it. That humans are created from a radical alteration of matter. You know, you can just take some matter and put it together and then give it a soul, right? So that there is no continuity then between humans and other hominids, right? The other two, there is that continuity, but there's an infusion of a soul. So the first option is there's an advanced hominid who's infused with a human soul, right? So he's walking around and is halfway through his life is given a human soul. And to me, that doesn't make sense, right? So the thing is, like physically, a non-human, it's going to have a non-human soul, and that's the type of thing it's going to be for all eternity, right? The third option is the only one I think that sort of makes sense. Not only does it make sense, I think, philosophically, it also makes sense theologically. So the first humans originate in the womb of an advanced hominid, right? So the idea would be that you have these two parents, they come together, and the sperm and egg that fuse to form the first human is slightly different. It's a slightly different set of matter. So that matter that comes together is the type of thing that's fitting to have a rational soul. And so the first humans form in the womb of an advanced hominid, right? The first theological humans, right? And that seems kind of odd, but I think it makes, to me, it makes sense given our understanding of Christ and his incarnation, right? So if we read human evolution through Christ and Mary, which is what we should do, right? We should try to understand things in relation to Christ, right? That's sort of our interpretive key to understanding everything in the universe, in a sense, right? So, you know, Christ is the true Adam, which is to say, just as John the Baptist must decrease, that Christ may increase, so also the first Adam is decreased to the degree that he doesn't make any sense except in light of Christ. Right? Put differently, the end reigns over the beginning because Christ, not Adam, is the true beginning. So if we really want to sort of shed light and understanding on the first humans, we have to look and see through the lens of Christ, right? And so how does Christ enter the world? Christ enters the world as a zygote, right? As a fertilizer in the womb of a creature, right? And so it seems like that's a much more mysterious thing than modern humans entering the world in the womb of an advanced hominid, right? I think it's fitting that you have creation, and God has prepared creation through over time to produce the type of thing that is fitting to have a rational soul and to emerge in the womb of a hominid, just as he emerges in the womb. He, the infinite God emerges in the womb of a creature. Right? I think there's a nice, an interesting parallel there. Okay. I'm going to stop there. Add some other slides about monogenism and polygenism, and we can take questions on that. But I think I'll stop there and then open up for questions so we have more time for questions. Okay.